Okay, good morning. You know, it almost feels somewhat normal to start the first Sunday of the year out doing Bible class before worship. You know, once upon a time, this was the schedule. But looking back at this last year, man, I tell you, nothing has been normal about our life this last year. But I'm confident that God's going to see us through this. I'm excited to see you here this morning. I'm excited for those that are joining us online this morning. I know we've had a number that have been hit with the virus this last week, and I know that we've got a lot of people tuning in to our class this morning, so our thoughts and prayers are with you. We're going to be studying the book of Proverbs for the month of January and February. If you look in your church bulletin, we've got a list of our classes that, who's going to be teaching them and so forth for this next quarter. So if you will, take a look at that. But for this class in here, this is going to be only for the months of January and February, but we're going to be looking primarily at Proverbs. Depending on how much or how quickly I get through the book, we will then transition into the book of Ecclesiastes, but we're in no rush to get through the book of Proverbs. I've never really studied the book of Proverbs, and I'm going to approach this study a little differently than we would any other book of the Bible, and there's some reasons for that, and I'll get into those later. But the book of Proverbs is so rich in wisdom. And you're going to hear that word an awful lot throughout this study, this idea of wisdom. If you were to Google, you'll find a lot of different proverbs. You know, if you were to just ask somebody off the street what a proverb is, you'll get a lot of different answers, but they'll all have a kind of a common theme to them. People will generally think of a proverb as being a wise saying that illustrates a common truth. You've heard a lot of these proverbs, secular proverbs, I might add, throughout your life. Your mom probably even had some proverbs whenever you were little growing up. A proverb is a short sentence that is full of meaning and sound advice. It's a short saying that is commonly known by the public and repeated as a piece of advice or a suggestion. A proverb usually expresses a common truth. Here's some popular English proverbs. You know, every culture has their own proverbs. If you've ever eaten at a Chinese restaurant, you get the little fortune cookies and you pull it out, and what's in there? It's a Chinese proverb. But here's some popular English proverbs. 2 wrongs doesn't make a right. Did your mom ever say that? 2 wrongs doesn't make a right. When somebody does something bad to you, trying to do something bad to them will only make things worse. I'm going to scroll through these and pick out some of my favorite ones. Haste makes waste. When you try to work too quickly, you usually make mistakes. Lie down with dogs, wake up with fleas. If you associate with bad or dishonest people, bad things will happen to you. Measure twice, cut one. It's hard to change a decision once you've made it. Actions speak louder than words. We've heard that one a lot in our life. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Everyone has their own ideas of what is beautiful. Better late than never, one of my favorite ones. It's better if you do something later than not to do it at all. We have a lot of wise sayings in our society, don't we, that illustrate a common truth. Well, we're going to be looking at some wise sayings found in the book of Proverbs that illustrate a spiritual truth. You know, as a Bible class teacher, I've always been interested in becoming a better teacher. And I've resigned myself to the fact that the only way I can become a better teacher is I have got to become a better student myself. So what I've done to prepare myself to teach this class and hopefully deliver it in a way that's going to make sense to you, that's going to help you come away with a deeper appreciation and understanding of the Proverbs, is I've enrolled myself as an informal student in World Video Bible School's lesson on Proverbs. What I'm doing is I'm kind of going through this course myself because I want to come away with a deeper appreciation, a richer understanding of the book of Proverbs. I want to caution you on studying the book of Proverbs like you would any other book. You know, any other book, we can read it chapter by chapter and kind of get the truth or the understanding, the concept relatively quick. The way Proverbs is written is it jumps from thought to concept so quickly that you really have to read Proverbs in bits and pieces. Or that's been my experience. As I've sat down and studied the Proverbs, I find that it's easier for me to comprehend if I read it and tackle it in bits and pieces. And I'll kind of, repeat that, as we go throughout this study. So if you have your Bibles, turn with me to the book of Proverbs. I'm going to be using the New American Standard for some of the points I'm going to make, and I'm also going to be reading out of my personal Bible, which is the New King James Version. If you know anything about the book of Proverbs, you know that we generally credit Solomon with being the author. I'm going to kind of go over some general introductory points this morning. I don't want to spend a lot of time going over who the author was. I think that that's important, but I don't think it's the most important thing in this class. Generally speaking, or not generally speaking, Solomon is the principal author of the book of Proverbs. There are some others that we credit with some of the Proverbs that we are going to find in our study. There's wise men over in chapters 22 through 24 who are credited with some of the Proverbs. In Proverbs chapter 30, verse 1, we see an individual by the name of Agar ben Jaka. And Lynn is not here to make fun of the way I pronounce that. I know he's probably listening, so I hope you get a chuckle out of that, Lynn. What's the purpose of the book of Proverbs? What's the purpose of all these wise sayings that we have in our society? Well, we find that purpose. We really find everything that we need to know about the book of Proverbs in basically the first 6 or 7 verses of chapter 1. It's about instruction. It's about knowing wisdom and instruction. It's about having the ability to discern sayings of understanding. It's about receiving instruction and wise behavior. And it really covers 3 major points: justice, righteousness, and equity. Equity being this idea of being fair and impartial. Those are 3 broad points, but I think it really encompasses everything that we're going to study in the book of Proverbs. It's about wise living compared to foolish living. It's about living godly in an ungodly world. It's about skillful living. Wisdom is about skill, having the ability to do the right thing in any given situation, knowing how to respond in any situation. We have the manual for how to do that right here, but we've got to read it, we've got to study it, we've got to meditate upon it, and we've got to pray and ask God to help us acquire the kind of wisdom and skill that we're going to be studying. I'm going to go ahead and read the first 7 verses. We may not read a lot of the Proverbs today. Again, this is kind of a general introduction. I think that we will appreciate this study more if we kind of go back and revisit some things that are foundational to this study. And I'm going to read chapter 1, verses 1 through 7, and this is going to come from the New King James Version. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. And again, purpose, theme are found here in these first 7 verses. To know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase learning, and a man of understanding will attain wise counsel. To understand a proverb and an enigma, the words of the wise and their riddles. As we go throughout this study, as we look at these points, knowing wisdom and instruction, the ability to discern sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, it's the focus here to try to help us to recognize that which is wise when we see it. And in order for us to truly do that, we have to be committed to studying God's Word. We want to strive to have the ability to discern, to be able to comprehend these sayings that we're going to read about in the book of Proverbs, so that we may benefit from it. What purpose is it to have knowledge and not benefit from it? The ultimate goal in all of this is to change behavior so that not only do we appreciate what's being said, what's been recorded for us in the book of Proverbs, but how can we change our conduct? How can we make ourselves better to glorify God? We need to know how to act wisely in these 3 major areas: righteousness, justice, and equity. As I said at the beginning of class, over the years I've occasionally read Proverbs. I've never sat down and really had an in-depth study of Proverbs like I'm doing right now. And again, some of you may have done this in the past, and I look forward to learning from you. I look forward to hearing from you in this class. I want you to share your experience, your knowledge about this book. But as I try to introduce us to this class, I'm going to kind of go into some things that I've just never really spent a lot of time myself exploring. And one of those is how to properly interpret the Proverbs. I think that's very important that we take some time and really to think about that. One of the things I want us to understand first and foremost about our study in Proverbs is that the Proverbs are inspired by God in their entirety. All these principles that we're going to see in the book of Proverbs, God has given us these Proverbs for the purpose of helping us choose the right course in life. There's some very neat, wise sayings that we're going to find in the book of Proverbs that really illustrate a spiritual truth for us. These are general commands and statements of truth and promises that cover a variety of different topics related to this life, just living day to day. everything from how we relate to God to our fellow man. So as we think about interpreting Proverbs, there's some things that I want us to stop and just kind of think about. And I think if we will stop and think about these points that relate to interpreting Proverbs, we will appreciate the Proverbs more, we will understand the Proverbs deeper, and we will come away with a better understanding. Not all Proverbs are to be taken literally. Let's look at some examples. And I'm just going to read through these really quickly. But as I read through these, I want you to remember that first point. Not all Proverbs are to be taken literally. Proverbs 15, verse 19. The way of the lazy man is like a hedge of thorns, but the way of the upright is a highway. Proverbs 21, 22. A wise man scales the city of the mighty and brings down the trusted stronghold. Well, when you read that proverb, the wise man doesn't literally scale the city. Another example, Proverbs 23, verse 2. And put a knife to your throat if you're a man given to appetite. No pun intended, but somebody that has a big appetite, we don't literally expect somebody to put a knife to their throat, do we? I see Batsel rubbing his belly over there. So not all Proverbs are meant to be taken literally, but there's a spiritual truth. There's a lesson for us behind those Proverbs. We're going to come across statements found in the book of Proverbs that may not always be true. I've heard Proverbs by some referred to as a book of half-truths. I don't know if I like that title per se, but I'll get into more of that in a little bit. But generally speaking, most of what we find in the book of Proverbs, if we apply it, all things being equal, as a general rule of thumb, generally speaking, things are going to work out. And I'll expand upon that a little bit later. But not all things are always going to be true. Here's an example of that. Proverbs chapter 29, verse 12. If a ruler pays attention to lies, all of his servants become wicked. Do all his servants become wicked? Not necessarily. If you remember the story of Saul, David and Jonathan were by no means wicked, were they? Look at Proverbs 15, verse 25. The Lord will destroy the house of the proud, but he will establish the boundary of the widow. Well, that's not always the case, is it? Go to Luke 16, don't go there literally, but if you remember the story of Lazarus in Luke 16, he didn't have an easy life, did he? He suffered in this life. Look at Proverbs 15, verse 19. The way of the lazy man is like a hedge of thorns, but the way of the upright is a highway. Does that mean if we live upright, spiritual lives, that we're going to have an easy life? Absolutely not. We know from Romans chapter 8, if you go there and read verse 31 through 38, we know that this life is going to be filled with challenges, even for God's people. We can look at 2 Timothy 3 through 12, and we know that if we strive to live a godly life, we're going to face persecution to some degree. We're going to have trials in this life. Statements made in Proverbs may not always be true. I'm going to go to a Proverbs that I think every parent here, I see you smiling, Judy. We all have heard it, haven't we? We have all have heard this. Proverbs 22, verse 6. train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Does that mean that that's always going to be the truth? Even the Proverbs show that a child that's brought up in the training and admonition of the Lord may still turn away. The general rule, again, remember I said Proverbs, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Proverbs is not a list of guarantees. Would anybody disagree with that statement? Proverbs is not a list of guarantees from God. You know, God has given us the book of Proverbs so that we may benefit from it. But again, this doesn't mean that if we do this, that this will always be the result. But as parents, we still raise our children in hopes that when they get older, they will not turn or depart from it. Another example, Proverbs chapter 3, verse 17. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. Well, does that mean that if we strive for wisdom, if we strive to live righteous, godly lives, that we will always enjoy peace in this life? Absolutely not. Did Jesus experience peace when he was here on this earth? Absolutely not. But nonetheless, as God's people, we still strive after that. Let's look at chapter 22, verse 4. Again, keeping with this theme of not every statement in the book of Proverbs is always going to be true. Chapter 22, verse 4. By humility in the fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life. Not everybody that strives to live godly lives are going to enjoy riches and honor. We certainly know that we've all known of people that are very humble that have never attained riches and honor. And of course, we know as God's people that we're not to live just for the mere pleasure of acquiring riches. We know that. But we know a lot of God-fearing, humble people that, from a worldly, secular perspective, they've struggled in this life. They've had it very difficult. But nonetheless, they strive to live a life that's pleasing to God. Kind of switch gears here. You know, again, we're talking about how to properly interpret the Proverbs, because there's a lot of different types of Proverbs that we're going to study. Some Proverbs are just merely suggesting having some forethought before we act. You know, if you're a parent here, you know, that's an easy concept, but sometimes it's very difficult to teach, isn't it? You know, as adults, we sometimes have yet to master that. You know, sometimes we need to go back to those basic teachings. You know, one of the things that I've appreciated finding out about the book of Proverbs is it doesn't give a hard, fast rule of action for every situation you find in life. But the Proverbs do teach us to think before we act. You know, when I was sitting here getting ready for this lesson, I got to thinking about that. If we could all just think before we act, boy, just think of the problems that we could eliminate in this life. Think of the problem. I think about the problems in my life that would have never become a problem had I just thought before I acted. You know, I can't make a statement like that without going and looking at some of these proverbs that speak on this very subject. Did you have your hand up, Paul? Go ahead.
That was a great statement, and it doesn't always work, but I think generally combining those thoughts of training a child in the way of the Lord, never depart. The same goes for making decisions, okay? So I didn't grow up in the church, I didn't grow up with a Christian background, so I made a lot of bad decisions because I didn't have a good foundation. And, one thing as a Marine, you train and then you react, okay? So when you train and you actually in that situation, that's how you react. And I think by training children God's Word, and even later on in life, if you really dive into God's Word, that will become your new foundation. You're basically rebuilding the foundation that what was laid. And so when you are in a situation, you have to make a choice. Well, instead of making a choice based on what you had been taught or had not been taught, now you're making decisions based on, now you're making them quick.
Right.
That's the way you can train. That was the illustration I thought about, because we react. And I've talked to people who were raised in the church. What I thought was normal was not normal. And from a Christian standpoint.
Sure.
So I had to change my thinking
Right.
a lot. And so now when I was faced with a certain situation, I handled it differently because then I was trained.
Right. No, that's a great point, Paul. And as you know, I kind of share your background experience as well. I didn't grow up in the church either, so a lot of this I had to learn for the first time when I became a Christian at the age of 21, almost 22, right before I got married to Becky. Thinking before we act, Proverbs chapter 15, verse 28, and I would encourage you to go to these as I read them out loud, because I want you to read these yourself, and I want them to really to sink in. The heart of the righteous studies how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours forth evil. Again, this idea of thinking before we act, and acting also means speaking. The idea of thinking before we speak or before we act. Proverbs chapter 19, verse 11, the discretion of a man makes him slow to anger, and his glory is to overlook a transgression. That's a real powerful proverb there. Man, to me, that's saying that's a sign of enormous spiritual strength when you've got your tongue under control and you've got the ability, when from a worldly perspective, the world would just expect you to kind of go off on a tyrant. But as a man or a woman of God, we recognize that that's not the life that we're called to live. Sometimes just the ability, the discipline to not say anything says everything. I don't know if I said that right, but I think you get the point that I'm trying to make. One more proverb, 21 verse 23. As I read this, I can't help but think about all the problems that could be resolved in this world if we just all practice this. Whoever guards his mouth and his tongue keeps his soul from troubles. I like that so much, I'm going to read it one more time. Whoever guards his mouth and tongue keeps his soul from troubles. Man, that is a powerful proverb. What good advice for us as we go into this next week. Proverbs chapter 26, verse 4 through 5. Here's a proverb that says, do not answer a fool, whereas the very next proverb says, answer a fool. So the question is, which one do we follow? Well, let's look at 26, verse 4 through 5 and read that. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him. Sounds like good advice. And in verse 5 it says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. So the question is, which one are we to really follow? And it's not a trick question. But I think we can go to the New Testament and look at Colossians 4 through 6, and we kind of get our answer there. And we're not going to go there, but in essence, what Colossians 4:6 tells us is that we ought to know how to respond to each person. If we don't study God's Word every day, if we don't commit ourselves to being students of the Bible, to praying, to meditating, we're not going to know how to do that. We're not going to know how to respond to people and to situations, to challenges, to trials. We're going to react. You know, Paul kind of talked about that earlier. You know, again, this idea of how do we interpret Proverbs? Here's another, kind of a different angle, and I know I'm switching gears, you know, quickly. Again, sole purpose for this morning is kind of introducing us to the study of Proverbs. Look at Proverbs chapter 22, verse 26 through 27. Do not be one of those who shakes hands in a pledge, or one of those who is surety for debts. If you have nothing with which to pay, why should he take away your bed from under you? You know, I guess somebody could read this and kind of come away with the question, does this mean that we should never borrow? Well, I think absolutely. You know, we know that the question or the answer is absolutely no, or else I'd be in a mess myself. You know, I've had to borrow, take out loans in my life, as I'm sure all of you have had to. But I think that there's a deeper lesson, a deeper spiritual truth that's really intended behind the Proverbs. And that's why I said it's careful that we really take our time as we read these Proverbs. Just like this one that I just got through reading here, verse 26 through 27. The idea is to have some prudence, to think about what we're doing before we do something. To not just go out and to borrow excessively. To be careful, to be prudent is the idea. I'm going to go through some of these others relatively quickly because I've got more material than I do time. Any questions, comments before I continue about what's been said thus far? I know that there's people listening online that obviously don't have the opportunity to ask questions, but if you're listening, please get with me later today if you have a question or comment about anything. But anybody here this morning? Doyle.
Proverbs, the way I look at them is they're general truths. And if you look at it, yes, that's generally the case, but then there could be exceptions to those things too. But
Yeah.
generally looking at it, we strive for the things, these bits of wisdom and knowledge, we strive for these things, generally this will be the outcome that we're looking at.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think that we need to be continually reminded of that. Because as God's people, as a person that wants to be in heaven one day, I know from studying Proverbs that generally speaking, if I do what the Proverbs say, I know what the anticipated result's going to be most of the time. But that's not 100% guarantee. But even though it's not 100% guaranteed, I'm still going to do it. Because I want to please God, and I want God to be happy with me. And I want to be in heaven one day. Proverbs are written in such a way that they are figurative. They're not necessarily literal, but they are figurative. In some ways, they've kind of got the same basic format of a parable. And if you think about a parable, it's a story that illustrates a spiritual truth. We don't necessarily look at the fine particulars of a parable as much as we do the overall story. What's the lesson for us? What's the spiritual truth that the writer is trying to convey to us? That's what we're trying to grasp. There's a spiritual truth behind the words. Proverbs are very practical. You know, we don't get our theology from the book of Proverbs, obviously. But we do get a lot of practical life lessons from the book of Proverbs. Again, we've referenced Proverbs 15 through 19 quite a bit this morning. I'm going to read that one again. It says, "The way of a lazy man is like a hedge of thorns, but the way of the upright is a highway." Does that mean that if somebody's having a difficult time in life, does that mean that they don't have a right relationship with God? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Proverbs are practical. They illustrate a spiritual truth. Proverbs are worded in such a way that they are intended to be memorable, not necessarily technically precise. Think about some of those English proverbs we have that we quote all the time just in everyday life without even thinking about it. They're memorable. Two wrongs don't make a right. Better late than never. You know, they're nothing technical about them, but they're memorable and they illustrate a point. And they illustrate a point quickly in any given situation. Proverbs chapter 24:14. I like to hear that sound, the pages of the Bible turning. Proverbs chapter 24:14. "So shall the knowledge of wisdom be to your soul. If you have found it, there is a prospect, and your hope will not be cut off." Have you ever known somebody that's very wise and spiritually mature that's died well before their time? Have all wise people seen their dreams come true? That's not always happened. That's not always the case, is it? As Doyle pointed out, Proverbs are general truths. Proverbs 3:17, I think we've read this one already this morning. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 17, "Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace." Are all paths of wisdom peaceful? I think you look in the world we live in today, and I think the answer is going to be no. It's just not always the case. Look at Jesus, our greatest example of wisdom. He had the ultimate wisdom, but was his life free from conflict? Proverbs are not guarantees from God. I think that we have hit on this already. But they're guidelines for good behavior. They're very practical. You know, if we're not careful, and I think I was guilty of this at some points in my life, early on as a Christian, looking at the book of Proverbs and making the assumption that that's a guarantee. When, you know, I think we've established at this point in our study that that's not necessarily the case. Generally speaking, though, if we do this, then we can expect this result. That's kind of the idea behind the sayings and the writings that we're going to be looking at in this study. But the book of Proverbs is inspired by God. I don't think that we ever need to lose sight of that fact. These Proverbs are inspired by God. You know, we looked at that Proverbs 22, verse 6, that one about a parent raising up their children in a way they should go, so that when they're older, they will not depart from it. That's one that hits home to us. That's one that's very personal, especially to those of us that have kids. You know, I've got 3 in there. Have I always been the best example? Absolutely not. But I have tried my best to bring them up in the way that they know that they should go, that the Lord has, told me as a father that I should bring them up. But there's a point in their life, and they're at that point. They have the ability to choose. They have that free moral choice. I can't force it on them. And I'm spending a little bit of time on that proverb because that's one that I think is just, very personal to a lot of us here. And it's, again, I made the statement, Proverbs are not guarantees, but they're think of them as poetic guidelines for good behavior. This is wisdom literature, but Proverbs are wonderful, wonderful guidelines for good behavior. It's possible to have godly parents who do a good job of raising their children, but maybe one of those children takes a different path. Proverbs 15 verse 25 is another example. The Lord will tear down the house of the proud, but He will establish the boundary of the widow. Again, I think we have alluded to this already, but there's no guarantees that if a person lives a humble, spiritual, God-fearing life, that they're going to enjoy the riches and pleasures on this side of eternity. I'll go through some of these next ones relatively quickly because we're just about out of time. Proverbs uses, in some cases, very specific language, and at some points, exaggerations to illustrate a point. We've already looked at 22:11. Proverbs chapter 25:24 is one that we've heard quoted several times. It is better to dwell in a corner of a housetop than in a house shared with a contentious woman. That's an exaggeration, but there's a spiritual truth behind it, right? Why are y'all laughing? There's a spiritual truth. There's a lesson behind that. Again, the Proverbs are not always meant to be taken literally, but there's a lesson, and that's where you and I have the responsibility as a student to find that lesson. Proverbs 23, verse 2, we've read that one already. And put a knife to your throat if you are a man of great appetite. No pun intended, but we're not going to expect Batzel to take a knife to his throat just because he has a big appetite. But what's the real lesson for us? What's the spiritual truth? It's one of moderation, self-control. Proverbs give good advice for wise approaches to many aspects in life, but they're not exhaustive. If you read the entire book of Proverbs this afternoon, it doesn't cover every single scenario that we can find in this life. But I think that you can encounter any scenario in this life and take the writings in Proverbs and apply the wisdom to come away with a good solution. Does that make sense? Such a good book for us to study. Proverbs 16 verse 3, commit your works to the Lord and your plans will be established. I'm going to read that again. Proverbs 16 verse 3, commit your works to the Lord and your plans will be established. I think we would all agree that's good, sound, practical advice, but it's not exhaustive. Not every single plan that we make is going to be established. Just like I said, the Proverbs don't really make an attempt to deal with every single situation that a person finds himself in. But as we go throughout this study, we're going to be able to apply the tenets of Proverbs, all the principles that we find in the book of Proverbs. And I firmly believe there's not a situation that we can encounter in this life that we can't apply some of these very tenets and principles to come away with a healthy, good solution to whatever that scenario is. I'm going to go ahead and stop right there. Next week, I'll finish up a little bit talking about interpreting the Proverbs. And then we're going to just kind of go through the book and kind of tackle this from a topical study. I'm not going to go through verse by verse because it'll be 2022 before we get to the book that way. Any questions, comments? Herschel?
I was just thinking about Solomon. He wrote 3,000 Proverbs, 1,000 Psalms, according to 1 Kings 4, verse 32.
Yeah.
And, he wasn't a guy who always did what he knew that he ought to do. So he's a very complex fellow, with so many wives and so much to do. And yet, still, the words that he spoke were true and inspired of God.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me feel a little bit better about myself sometimes when I feel that I'm letting God down. Because, in Solomon's life, he let God down so much, especially with his wives and his relationship to those who worship false gods.
Yes. That's a very good point to end on, and I'm actually going to talk a little bit about Solomon next week, but if you're listening online, kind of the point that Herschel was making is, as wise as Solomon was not always the best example in this life. And we'll pick up with that again next week, and I appreciate everybody's attendance here, and thank you to those that are joining us online. Look forward to seeing you in person again, Lord willing.